Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good day. My name is Bob Rush, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives. Today we're going to be discussing with two experts a law that's been around for some 50 years. Since 1970, workplace safety has been regulated in part by OSHA, and there's an interaction between the federal law and the state law. And two experts will be with us. Unfortunately, we invited the Commissioner of Labor, State Department of Iowa, and they declined to appear or to send a representative. But Paul Iverson, leading expert in the field. Paul, would you share a little bit about your background and what you do, please?
Sure. I'm a labor educator with the University of Iowa Labor Center, and we do research and education for unions and other worker groups around the state of Iowa. But I've been doing that for 11 years. For 22 years before that, I was a lawyer representing unions in Minnesota. And as a labor educator, I have a focus on health and safety issues, and particularly workplace fatigue.
Thank you, Paul. Dylan Parker, would you share, please, with our viewers your background, please?
Sure thing. Thanks, Bob. My name is Dylan Parker. I'm a construction analyst with a nonprofit organization called the Indiana-Illinois-Iowa Foundation for Fair Contracting. In my role as a construction analyst, I visit public sector construction projects across eastern Iowa. So that's when a city is building a new street or laying new water utility. I visit those job sites to monitor them and make sure that the contractors are following all of the rules and regulations that they're supposed to ensure a level playing field in the industry.
Thank you. Paul, would you give us a little background on OSHA? Where did it come from? How long has it been around?
Yeah, and it's interesting because OSHA actually means two different things, and so it sometimes gets a little confusing. OSHA stands for the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which was passed in 1970 and signed by President Nixon. That is the federal law that regulates workplace safety. But it also stands for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is the government agency that the act created to enforce the act. So it gets a little confusing sometimes if someone says, well, that violates OSHA, then they're talking about the statute or the rules that were promulgated pursuant to the statute. But if they say, you shouldn't be doing that, I'm going to call OSHA, then they're talking about OSHA, the agency. So they call up OSHA to enforce OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Back in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a culmination of decades of work by workplace safety advocates to get a federal health and safety law. And at the time, with many fewer employees than are working today, there are about 14,000 employee deaths a year. And workplace safety advocates said, we have to do something about this. And so Congress passed the law and President Nixon signed it. And it has certainly had a good effect. There are, with many, many more employees working, there's about 3,000 deaths a year, but it's much more than it really needs to be. There are many needless deaths that if people actually followed OSHA standards, a lot of the deaths are preventable. And next month, April 28th, is Worker Memorial Day. And at that time, we'll recognize the people that died at work within the last year. And that's always something that I put together a presentation on. And it's sad to go through all of the people that have died and how they died at work.
And I've seen it reported that Iowa fatalities on the job are above the national average. And Dylan, could you shed some light on why or why not that is?
Sure. So Iowa is unique. It's not the only state, but it is unique in the sense that the federal act that Paul was just describing allowed for sort of an opt-out clause in that OSHA, the agency, was going to administer the act across the United States, except for in states that opted to have their own state plan in place. There's a handful of states across the United States that chose to go this route, and one of them is Iowa. So, for example, if a worker in Iowa is concerned about job site safety and they call OSHA, they're not calling the federal agency in DC or the other regional offices across the country, but in fact, they're calling a representative within the Iowa, the state agency that handles Iowa OSHA. And there may be some just nature of the Iowa economy and the different types of businesses here that may be more hazardous to workers. But also there may be a difference in the way in which the state of Iowa administers the OSHA requirements versus the federal. Federal OSHA requires that states maintain minimum standards at least as strong as the federal agency. But as I've experienced in my job as a construction analyst, there's been some concern with that regard.
Thank you. Paul, what happens if somebody gets hurt on the job in an unsafe situation? What are the remedies available to that worker finding himself in an unsafe environment?
Yeah, and that's a problem with OSHA, both federal and Iowa, is that the penalties are not very severe. And there isn't compensation for the person that gets injured. What OSHA will do is, based on a complaint or based on certain types of injuries or deaths, will come in and do an investigation and see if the Occupational Safety and Health Act has been violated, and then can issue fines, which are not severe, like $7,500 for a serious violation, and part of the issue is that if a complaint is made, OSHA will do an investigation, but the Iowa OSHA and federal OSHA are both terribly underfunded. Very dedicated employees, do good work, know their job, but there's just not enough of them. And, for instance, in Iowa, I have heard people say that if they were to inspect every job site in Iowa with their current staff, it would take them 150 years. So it's very unlikely that someone is going to be subject to a random inspection. So it's only in the case of someone calling to complain that any investigation will take place.
So if a worker feels he's in an unsafe situation, what's his remedy? Call the Iowa OSHA?
Yeah, certainly if you believe, there's a couple of things that can happen. If an employee reasonably believes that they've been asked to do something that could lead to their death or serious bodily injury, then there's a right under OSHA to refuse to do the work. You don't have to die to keep your job. So if your employer is your job is to climb up up to a wind turbine 300 feet in the air, and there's freezing rain and high winds, making it dangerous to do so. You don't have to climb. You can just say, no, I refuse to do that. You can also call OSHA, and they will, staff time allowing, respond and at least call the employer to say, you should do something about this. But it's rare that they're going to respond immediately during the time that the dangerous condition exists.
Dylan, what happens if a worker makes that call to Iowa OSHA and the employer says, "You're out of here, buddy. You ratted us out. You're gone."
Yeah, well, the legislation includes provisions that allow for like whistleblower protection and protection on the job if you call OSHA. So technically speaking, the law protects workers that call OSHA. The reality, if you ask many workers who have called OSHA, is that, the boss won't fire you for calling OSHA. They'll fire you for showing up 5 minutes late the next day. So it gets into a very complicated situation. In addition to that, I just would like to piggyback off of what Paul was just saying. It's been my experience, as for part of my work, a lot of what I do is call OSHA. I visit these job sites and I find workers in excavations 12 feet underground with no protections from the excavation caving in on them. It's an extremely hazardous situation for construction workers in Iowa. And there are technologies to prevent it from happening, but it costs companies money to use that equipment. As such, unfortunately, I run across it a lot. And when I call Iowa OSHA and say, "Hey, there's a situation here. There's a national emphasis program specifically targeted on excavations." It's been my experience that Iowa OSHA's response is to call up the employer, not even do an in-person visit and inspection at the job site. Call them up and say, "Hey, we've heard that you're doing this. Is this true?" And nothing really comes of it. So it's a very difficult situation for workers to remain safe at work.
Paul, is it a deterrent to workers, that fear of retaliation if they do in fact make a safety complaint?
Certainly it is. And what you find nationwide is that OSHA is enforced most regularly on work locations where the employees are represented by a union, because then they have some protections and they're banding together for their mutual aid and protection, and they won't be randomly retaliated against because of an OSHA complaint, because the employer has to have just cause to discipline. In non-union workplaces, OSHA is violated, and there's nationwide research on this that OSHA is violated much more in non-union workplaces. So your best bet for worker safety is to be part of a union so that you have the protections, and someone, often the union will have a safety representative who is watching out for things like that.
Dylan, can the employee have the union file that complaint on his behalf, or does it have to be something purely driven by the employee?
For workplaces that have union representation for the workers, they are allowed by Iowa's OSHA law to have the union representative file a complaint. I'm very familiar with the form that Iowa OSHA uses to submit a complaint. I filled it out many times. At the very bottom of it, there is a part where you check the box and indicate if you are a representative of the employees and not the employee themselves. I work for a nonprofit organization. I do not check that box myself, but yes, it certainly is an option for workers who are represented by a union in Iowa.
So, Paul, we touched on it before, but inspections, if that worker in an unsafe situation, how can that worker drive an inspection?
Well, you can call and complain to OSHA, and then it depends upon the type of complaint, whether there is an immediate investigation. And so there are priorities, and I'm sorry I didn't look up the priorities, but there are investigation priorities that OSHA has, and some things like certainly the highest level is imminent danger. So if you make a complaint and say, that you're working 12 feet underground, as Dylan was saying, and there's no trench box to protect you, something that is of imminent danger of killing you, that's the highest level, and somebody is going to respond the most quickly. But it depends on the level of the violation and how many people are involved, and so there are enforcement criteria, and so if you do complain, if it meets the enforcement criteria, then someone will come and investigate, and then the employee has the right to go around with the investigator to show them what they're talking about.
Does the law impose any time limit for the agency, Iowa OSHA, to respond or to investigate or in any way?
Do you want to take that, Dylan, or?
Not really. We'll put it that way. In fact, that is the excuse that I have received many times regarding Iowa OSHA not coming out to job sites. For example, I'll submit a complaint or a referral to Iowa OSHA, and then they won't come out for a day or two, and then that part of the job is done. The trench is filled in, or whatever the unsafe part of it was is complete, and so then there's no need to do the inspection, right? So the timelines are very loose, and often excuses like, well, we didn't have any inspectors in that part of Iowa that day are given.
Now, Iowa is a minority of the states that are running their own OSHA program. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. State plan states, I think, as Dylan mentioned before, OSHA doesn't cover public employees. So individual states have to pass their own version of OSHA if they want their public employees to be covered by an Occupational Safety and Health Act. Iowa elected to do so. And then if a state has its own Occupational Safety and Health Act, and what Iowa basically did is said, we'll just follow OSHA here in Iowa with our public employees. When they have that statute in place, they can petition to be a state plan state, and then federal OSHA will say, okay, since you already have this agency, you're already doing investigations that are at least as good as what we're doing, then we will defer to you in your investigations. And so because Iowa has done that, has asked to be a state plan state, and has been approved by the Department of Labor, by Occupational Safety and Health Administration, then they get the enforcement in the first instance, and it's difficult to get federal OSHA in once into a state plan state.
Do either of you know of situations where the states that are running their own programs have had that authorization revoked or in any way put on some sort of probationary status?
Paul?
Yeah, I'm not aware of whether any of the states have had it revoked. There is a process for making a complaint to the Department of Labor and saying that, the idea of a state plan state is that you have to do at least as well as federal OSHA would do. And so there's a type of complaint that can be issued to say, well, they're not doing that in Iowa. And then the DOL can decide ultimately whether the job that Iowa OSHA is doing is good enough that they can continue to be a state plan state.
Okay. Now, Dylan, as I understand it, some 8 labor and civil rights organizations did in fact file a complaint about Iowa OSHA. They filed a complaint with the U.S. Department of Labor. Is that, has your organization been involved in that?
Yes, our organization was one of the 8 Iowa organizations that filed the CASPA complaint about state plan administration with the Federal Department of Labor. We joined with other organizations that were equally frustrated with the state of Iowa's OSHA enforcement. It was kind of a unique partnership where there were some organizations that were responding to the COVID-19 crisis in Iowa's meatpacking plant industries. There was a lot of media coverage of that when that was going down. And then while I don't work in the meatpacking industry, I was very familiar with Iowa OSHA, having worked in the construction industry for a number of years. So we kind of came together and said, hey, there seems to be a bigger issue going on here with Iowa OSHA. So we worked together to file that complaint with the federal government.
As I understand it, at the time of that filing, there had been something like 148 complaints made about work environment being unsafe, and Iowa Department of Labor had only conducted 5 inspections out of those 148 complaints that have been made.
Yes, that's correct. I believe a majority of those were from the meatpacking plants. However, as part of the complaint, I was able to provide over a dozen examples of when I personally had contacted Iowa OSHA in the years prior to the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak. So this would have been before 2019, of examples where I had contacted Iowa OSHA about imminent dangers to Iowa workers, where a Iowa OSHA inspector simply just didn't show up at the job site. So there was a long history of it happening, in my opinion, but certainly the 5 out of 150 or so, it was a telling case in 2019.
And the complaint itself says all those other cases or complaints were closed without even an inspection.
That's correct. The vast majority of the inspections that I personally have submitted to Iowa OSHA it's what is called a phone-in fax, where a inspector with Iowa OSHA will simply call up the employer and say, hey, we got this complaint, what's going on? And then the employer says, oh, we fixed that, or whatever. No visual inspection, no real verification that things have changed at the job site, and Iowa OSHA closes the case. And it's been my experience that they don't even inform the complainer that the inspection is closed. So I have to follow up with Iowa OSHA to say, hey, whatever happened in my complaint?
Paul, is the meatpacking industry an area in which worker safety has more significant issues than other industries?
I guess I can't say for sure. Well, yeah, I think I can say. I mean, meatpacking, there's a lot of issues. It's there are fast production lines that are speeding up more and more. And people working around dangerous equipment. If your knives aren't sharpened appropriately, it can cause all sorts of issues. So there are amputations, there are other types of injuries, particularly under COVID. People who are in close proximity to each other, defined as essential employees, and people were complaining that this is just an unsafe environment. And the problem was that OSHA said we don't have a standard to enforce. There's no infectious disease standard, but there is under OSHA a general duty clause for all employers to provide a safe and healthy work environment for every employee. And that general duty clause applies even if there's not a specific standard that OSHA has promulgated. So that was one of the things that it was frustrating for some that you couldn't enforce the general duty clause and say, hey, you've got a general duty to. So yeah, nobody anticipated COVID, but what are you going to do to keep people safe in this new environment?
In the few minutes we have remaining, I'd like to go first to Dylan. And are there any closing thoughts, Dylan, that you would offer to our viewers about the whole area of workplace safety and how an employee can guard against unsafe conditions?
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I appreciate having been invited onto the show and had the opportunity to chat. As much of the conversation tonight has focused on how workplace safety benefits workers, which is a pretty big obvious, I would just like to highlight the often overlooked aspect of how proper enforcement of laws and regulations actually benefits business as well. Again, my organization is funded by construction contractors. They came together, the ones that follow the rules, that use the trench box. Like I said, that is expensive to keep workers safe. And when these construction contractors that follow the rules are repeatedly underbid by fly-by-night contractors that want to low road things and cut corners and not provide their employees with safe equipment, well, that creates an unfair bidding environment for these contractors that are trying to do the right thing. So it's not only a worker issue, but making sure that we are properly enforcing workplace safety also makes sure that the contractors and the business owners in Iowa that invest in their workforce and that want to do the right thing are able to compete fairly.
And Paul, the responsible employer wants to make sure there are as few injuries or fatalities as possible, right?
Oh, that's definitely true. Employers and employees benefit from safe workplaces. The one little last thing that I would like to say is I don't want anything that I've said to be construed as being critical at all of the public employees that work for OSHA. They are dedicated employees who work hard at their jobs. They have been failed by the political leaders who do not sufficiently fund the agency. There simply needs to be more emphasis on workplace safety, more resources put into keeping our workers safe. We shouldn't have as many people dying as we do each year, but it's not the fault of public employees who work hard and do their best. They deserve to have the resources necessary to enforce the statute as well.
Well, gentlemen, thank you. We've touched on a lot of complexities in the law, and it invites far more discussion than time permits. But thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in today.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.